I executed the traitor and seized his throne to end his bloodline, never realizing I had just appointed his daughter as my personal stable boy. The winter sun hung low over the grey battlements of Severin's new conquest, casting long, sharp shadows across the frost-nipped gardens. King Severin Blackthorne stood in the centre of the hedge maze, his heavy royal purple cloak dragging through the brittle grass. He looked upon the stones of the fortress with a cold, proprietary eye. He had spent years breaking his enemies and securing his borders. This castle was the final piece of a bloody puzzle. Severin adjusted the weight of his crown, his expression a mask of cold command, a shield he had forged through a lifetime of war. To the world, he was a stone king, incapable of doubt or mercy. Behind him, a herald shuffled through a stack of scrolls, his breath misting in the frigid air. The man coughed nervously before gesturing toward a line of servants standing at rigid attention. They were the ghosts of the old regime, dressed in mourning black and trembling as they awaited their fate. Severin's gaze swept over them with the clinical detachment of a general counting his spoils, until his eyes stopped at the very end of the line. There stood a figure in the stained, rough wool of the stables. The boy was small, holding a worn leather cap against his leg, but he stood with a quiet dignity that was entirely out of place among the groveling staff. When Severin approached, the boy didn't lower his head. Instead, he met the king's gaze directly. His eyes were a startling amber, bright with a resolve that Severin found both irritating and fascinating. "What is your name?" Severin asked, his voice low and commanding, yet lacking the harshness he usually reserved for his conquered enemies. "Ash Veyne, your majesty," the boy replied. The voice was steady and pleasant, lacking the frantic edge of fear that usually permeated these gardens. Ash stood perfectly still, even as the wind whipped a loose strand of hair across his face. He simply waited, watching the king as if he were the one being judged. Severin felt a flicker of genuine surprise at such composure. This wasn't the broken creature he expected to find in the wake of a traitor's fall. There was steel in this stable boy, a strength forged in the margins of the world that most people simply chose to ignore. "You will remain here," Severin declared, his voice cutting through the wind. "I require those who know the quirks of these walls to maintain them. Report to the master of horse." The king turned away, his cloak billowing like a shadow. He believed he had finally secured his kingdom and erased the traitor's legacy once and for all. He walked toward the great hall, never looking back at the humble girl in the stable boy's rags who watched him go, the rightful heir to the stones he now claimed as his own. The herald's voice droned through the sharp Highland air, echoing off the ancient stone battlements, but King Severin Blackthorne had ceased listening several minutes prior. His attention was fixed upon a single, undeniable reality: the man who had been his father's sworn enemy, the traitor who had spent a lifetime undermining the crown, was finally broken. Every acre of the rugged northern moorland, every jagged stone of the manor, and every secret held within the fortress walls now belonged to him. The irony of the moment was so profound it bordered on cruelty. Severin stood in the very heart of the sanctuary that had once been used to plot his father's downfall. Severin stood tall and authoritative in the center of the castle garden, his royal purple cloak trailing against the damp grass. He maintained an expression of cold, aristocratic indifference, a mask he had perfected over years of bloody campaigns and courtly betrayals. It was a shield he wore against a world that had shown him little kindness, a barrier that ensured no one could see the tumult of old grievances and new responsibilities swirling beneath the surface. To his soldiers, he was the iron-willed conqueror. To the survivors of this house, he was a storm that had finally made landfall. "Your Majesty," the herald continued, shifting his weight with visible discomfort while adjusting a heavy parchment scroll. "There is one additional provision regarding the household staff that requires your immediate attention." Severin raised a stern eyebrow, his gaze sweeping over the grey stone battlements that loomed over the manicured hedges. What possibly could add to the absurdity of standing in a dead man's garden, surrounded by the remnants of a shattered legacy? "Speak it, then," Severin commanded, his voice carrying the weight of his crown. The herald cleared his throat, shuffling through his papers with evident unease. The late Lord's decree, along with the terms of the seizure, stipulate that the essential staff of Graystone Manor are to remain under your protection. They are to maintain the infrastructure of the estate until such time as you see fit to replace them. Among them, Your Majesty, is the master of the stable's assistant, a boy who has managed the horses here since the uprising began. Severin felt his jaw tighten. He looked toward the small army of servants standing at rigid attention near the carriage house, viewing them with the clinical detachment one might afford a forgotten piece of furniture. They were humans reduced to clauses in a military decree, yet the word, overlooked, struck him with unexpected force. He knew something of being overlooked, of existing on the margins of a world that valued only those born with the right name and the right power. Before his ascension, he had been a younger son with little hope of the throne, scraping by on his wits and the sharpness of his sword. He began to walk toward the line of survivors, his heavy boots crunching on the gravel. He passed the trembling cooks and the grey-haired butler, his eyes searching for anything that felt like a threat or a secret. He found it at the very end of the line. Standing slightly apart from the others was a figure he had expected to be a pale, broken creature crushed by the weight of defeat. Instead, he found someone of quiet, stubborn dignity. It was the stable boy, dressed in a simple, earth-toned tunic and high leather boots, his face smeared with the light dust of the stalls. He stood with his hands loosely at his sides, holding a worn cap, but it was his eyes that arrested Severin. They were of an unusual amber shade, meeting the king's stern gaze directly, without the downcast submission or the breathless flutter that commoners usually affected in his presence. There was something almost challenging in the boy's composure, as though he were daring the king to find a reason to cast him out. "What is your name, boy?" Severin asked, stopping directly in front of him. "Ash Veyne, Your Majesty," the boy replied. His voice was low and pleasant, carrying a steadiness that Severin had not heard since he crossed the castle gates. "I am told you are now my dependent," Severin said, testing the boy's resolve. "To be housed and fed at my pleasure, according to the terms of your master's failure. I have managed these stables since I was barely grown, Your Majesty," Ash said, a slight edge of steel entering his tone. "I have no intention of being a burden or a charity. If you permit me to continue in my capacity, I shall endeavor to stay out of your way and ensure your horses are the finest in the kingdom. If that is what you mean by arrangements, then I am fully informed." Severin felt a flicker of genuine surprise. Beneath the plain work clothes and the humble title was a person of iron, forged by years of isolation and the indifference of a cold master into something far stronger than anyone had bothered to notice. He realized that this boy, Ash, was magnificent in his own quiet way, a person who refused to be diminished by the circumstances of a war he hadn't asked for. "That will not be necessary," Severin said, watching a spark of something, disappointment or perhaps relief, flicker in those amber eyes. "I mean that while your assistance with the stables is required, I do not expect you to remain invisible. You are part of this estate now, and you will be treated with the respect your work earns." The silence that followed was profound. Ash stared at the king as though the monarch had suddenly begun speaking in a forgotten tongue. His composure cracked for a fleeting second, revealing a flash of raw vulnerability beneath the grit. "I do not understand," the boy whispered. "You need only believe that things will be different under my reign," Severin replied, surprised by the sudden gentleness in his own heart. "Come, show me the stables. I should like to see exactly what I have inherited." As they walked toward the carriage house, Severin observed more than the horses and the tack. He watched Ash move through the halls and courtyards of his childhood home with the ease of long familiarity, his fingers trailing along the door frames with an unconscious affection that spoke of a deep attachment to the land itself. Severin realized he had not just seized an enemy's fortress, he had inherited a living history, embodied by a boy who saw the world with more clarity than any advisor in his court. He did not yet know that in seeking to understand the past of these stone walls, he had just taken his first step toward a future he never dared to dream of. The morning sun had yet to crest the jagged peaks of the highlands when Severin found himself standing at the entrance of the stables, the scent of damp straw and old leather rising to meet him in the chill air. He had spent a restless night in the traitor's former chambers, finding the silk sheets and carved mahogany less comfortable than a bed of pine needles on the campaign trail. The castle was quiet, the heavy silence of a conquered house pressing in on him, and he had sought the stables in hopes of finding the one thing that made sense in his world, a fine horse and the prospect of a ride to clear his head. He found Ash Veyne already at work, moving with a rhythmic, quiet efficiency among the stalls. The boy was grooming a massive black warhorse, Severin's own mount, with a steady hand that spoke of long years of familiarity with high-strung beasts. Ash did not jump or stammer when the king's shadow fell across the threshold. Instead, he simply glanced over his shoulder, his amber eyes reflecting the soft lantern light before he returned to his task. "You are early, Your Majesty," Ash said, his voice carrying that same pleasant steadiness that had piqued Severin's interest the day before. "The stallion hasn't finished his oats, and the mist is still too thick for a safe gallop on the moor." Severin felt a prickle of annoyance at the boy's casual tone. It was a strange sensation. Usually, men tripped over their own tongues in his presence, desperate to offer the correct honorifics or the most flattering observations. This boy spoke as if they were merely two men discussing the weather over a fence. "I did not ask for a weather report, Ash," Severin replied, his voice dropping into the low, dangerous register he used to command his generals. He stepped further into the stable, his heavy boots echoing on the stone floor. "I asked for a horse. I find the air inside these walls stifling." Ash paused, leaning his weight against the stallion's flank as he looked at the king. "It is the history, I suspect. Graystone doesn't take kindly to new masters. It has a way of holding on to its secrets." "Is that your professional opinion as a stable hand?" Severin asked, his jaw tightening. "That the stones are restless?" Ash didn't back down. A slight, almost imperceptible smile touched his lips, a flash of that nervous resolve that Severin had noted during their first meeting. "My opinion, sire, is that you are looking at the battlements when you should be looking at the foundations. You spent your energy breaching the main gate, but if I were a man looking to reclaim this house, I wouldn't bother with the gate at all." Severin's annoyance was suddenly eclipsed by a sharp, military curiosity. He moved closer, the mask of command slipping just enough to reveal the strategist beneath. "The main gate is 10-inch oak reinforced with iron. The walls are 6 feet thick. What could you possibly know of reclaiming a fortress?" Ash set down the grooming brush and gestured toward the far end of the stables, where the ancient stone met the natural cliffside. "The late lord was a man of grand gestures, much like yourself. He fortified what could be seen. But the stables were built over a natural spring that feeds the well in the inner courtyard. During the spring rains, the water rises. To keep the stalls dry, the builders carved a drainage system that runs straight out to the ravine behind the kitchen gardens." The boy walked toward a heavy wooden crate in the corner, shifting it with a strength that seemed surprising for his slender frame. He pointed to a small, iron-grated opening in the floor, nearly hidden by a layer of fresh hay. "The grate is rusted through," Ash continued, his tone clinical. "A small person, or a determined one, could slip through the drainage tunnel and emerge inside the kitchen pantry. From there they would have access to the servants' stairs and, eventually, the royal wing. Your guards are watching the horizon, Your Majesty, but they aren't watching the floorboards." Severin stared at the grate, his mind instantly mapping the tactical nightmare Ash had just described. The boy was right. It was a glaring vulnerability, one that his own engineers had overlooked in their rush to secure the perimeter. He looked at Ash, trying to reconcile the dirt-smeared face of a stable boy with the tactical mind of a seasoned scout. "Why tell me this?" Severin asked, his gaze narrowing. "If you felt any loyalty to the man who lived here before me, you would have kept that secret. You could have used it to let his friends back in." Ash met his gaze, and for a moment, the amber eyes seemed to hold a centuries-old weariness. "I told you, sire, things are different now. I have no interest in seeing more blood spilled on these floors. Besides, a horse knows when his rider is unstable. A kingdom is no different. If you are to be the master of Graystone, you should at least know where the cracks are. Severin bristled at being compared to a rider by a servant, yet he could not deny the value of the boy's frankness. Ash Veyne was a riddle, annoying, disrespectful, and dangerously observant. Fix it, Severin commanded, turning toward the door. Secure the grate and map every other crack you know of. You will report to me tonight in the library. And Ash? The boy looked up, his hand already back on the stallion's neck. Yes, Your Majesty? Watch your tongue, Severin said, though the steel in his voice lacked its usual bite. Not everyone admires a servant who speaks the truth so plainly. As Severin walked back toward the castle, the annoyance lingered, but it was accompanied by a new, unsettling respect. He had come to Graystone to end a line of traitors, but he was beginning to suspect that the most formidable person in the entire valley was the one currently shoveling manure in his stables. The heavy oak doors of the library groaned as Severin pushed them open, revealing a cavernous room where dust motes danced in the fading amber light of the evening. He had come seeking the maps and ledgers Ash had promised, a way to quantify the hidden vulnerabilities of his new domain, but the silence of the room suggested it had been abandoned for decades. Shelves of dark wood reached toward the vaulted ceiling, packed with volumes in Latin, Greek, and the old tongue, their spines cracked with age and neglect. It was a sanctuary of thought in a house built for war, and it felt more like a tomb until Severin spotted a flicker of movement near the far wall. Ash was perched in a window seat that had been worn smooth by years of use, nearly invisible against the heavy velvet curtains. The stable boy was no longer holding a pitchfork or a grooming brush, instead, a thick, vellum-bound treatise lay across his lap. Ash didn't look up immediately, his eyes moving with a hungry intensity across the lines of text. I did not realize the stable hands of Graystone were required to be scholars, Severin said, his voice echoing through the stacks. Ash started, the book nearly slipping from his knees before he caught it with a practiced hand. He stood quickly, though he did not offer the standard bow of a servant. The horses do not require it, Your Majesty. But the mind tends to wander when the body is kept in the dirt. Severin crossed the room, his gaze falling on the title of the book. It was a rare text on the philosophy of governance and the ethics of conquest. A heavy choice for a light evening. Can you even read the script? I can read it, Ash replied, a spark of that stubborn pride returning to his amber eyes. And I can understand it. The author argues that justice is merely the shadow cast by the man holding the sword. He claims that a conqueror's only duty is to remain strong enough to keep what he has taken. A sound principle, Severin remarked, leaning against a nearby shelf. It is the law of the world. I seized this castle because I was stronger than the man who held it. That is the only justice required. Is it? Ash challenged, stepping out of the shadows. If strength is the only measure of justice, then you have not inherited a kingdom, sire, you have merely inherited a target. If someone stronger arrives tomorrow, by your own logic, their theft would be just. Severin felt a surge of genuine irritation, yet it was laced with a fascination he couldn't suppress. This boy was debating the very foundations of his reign with a clarity that his own advisors lacked. Justice is the order I bring to the chaos. Without my strength, the valley would bleed. Order is not justice if it is built on the bones of those who had no choice, Ash countered, his voice low and unwavering. The late lord believed he was just because he protected his own secrets. You believe you are just because you won a war. Neither of you ever stopped to ask if the people beneath you felt the weight of your mercy. Severin moved closer, his presence looming over the boy, but Ash did not flinch. You speak as though you have spent your life in these stacks, judging the world from a window seat. What could a stable boy know of the weight of a crown? I know that a crown is a heavy thing to wear when it is stolen, Ash said, his gaze locked with Severin's. And I know that I once wrote anonymously to the very scholar who penned this book, suggesting that any true reform must begin with the consent of the governed rather than the edge of a blade. He published my critique in his second edition, though he addressed his thanks to a gentleman of high learning. He never imagined it came from a boy who smells of horseflesh. The silence that followed was profound, the air between them thick with a sudden, electric tension. Severin looked at the boy, at the dirt beneath his fingernails and the fierce intelligence in his amber eyes, and felt a shift in the world he thought he understood. He had come to Graystone to root out the remnants of a traitor, but he found himself standing before a mind that was far more formidable than any army he had faced. "I suspect, Ash Veyne," Severin said quietly, his voice lacking its usual coldness, "that you have been grievously underestimated by every man who ever walked these halls." "Perhaps," Ash replied, his resolve softening just enough to reveal a flash of raw vulnerability. "But being invisible has its advantages. It allows one to see the truth while the masters are too busy looking at their own reflections." Severin reached out, his hand hovering near the book in Ash's lap before he withdrew it. "Keep the book. And the maps. I find I should very much like to hear your lecture on the rest of this library." As the king walked away, the shadow of the shelves closing in behind him, he realized he was no longer looking for cracks in the stone walls. He was looking for the truth of the person who had spent a lifetime hiding in their shadow, and for the first time in years, the mask of cold command felt like a burden he was tired of carrying. The candle on the late lord's mahogany desk had burned down to a jagged stump, its flame flickering violently in the draught that swept through the private study. Severin sat amidst a sea of ledgers and maps, the cracks in the fortress that Ash had pointed out now haunting his thoughts. He had come here to finalize the logistics of his occupation, yet the room felt heavy with the presence of the man he had sent into exile, a man he had called a traitor for a lifetime. While searching for the deeds to the northern pastures, Severin's hand brushed against a spring-loaded latch hidden beneath the desk's velvet lining. With a dull click, a shallow drawer slid open, revealing a single envelope of thick, cream-colored parchment. It was sealed with deep red wax, but it bore no crest. Instead, the words, "To my successor," were written in a jagged, desperate hand. Severin broke the seal, his movements stiff and measured. He expected to find a confession of greed or a map to hidden gold. Instead, as he unfolded the page, the voice of his enemy rose from the paper with a haunting clarity that chilled his blood. The letter spoke of a court far more dangerous than any battlefield Severin had ever walked, a place where the king's advisors were wolves in silk, and where the previous monarch's favorites were being systematically purged to make room for a new, corrupt regime. The late lord described a night 10 years ago when he had realized that his proximity to the throne had painted a target on his family. He had not betrayed the crown out of spite, he had fabricated a rift, playing the part of the disgruntled traitor to justify withdrawing to the highlands and disappearing from the capital's lethal radar. "I accepted the brand of traitor so that the wolves would look elsewhere," the letter read. "I allowed my name to be dragged through the dirt so that the one treasure I had left could remain buried in the shadows, safe from the appetites of the court." Severin felt the air leave his lungs. He read the next lines twice, his hands beginning to tremble as the world he thought he knew began to tilt. "My daughter, Serafina, has spent her life in the stables. She thinks me cold, and perhaps it is better that way. If she does not know who she is, she cannot accidentally reveal it. She is the true heir to the Blackthorne line, not by conquest, but by blood. I ask you, whoever you are, do not look for a princess. Look for the child who learned to be invisible. Protect her from the world I was forced to leave behind." The realization struck Severin with the force of a physical blow. The stable boy, with the amber eyes, the Ash, who had stood before him with such nervous resolve, and debated the nature of justice, was not a servant. She was the daughter of the house, a princess who had been hidden in plain sight, forced to shovel manure and sleep in the hay to survive a world that would have devoured her. Severin stood abruptly, his heavy purple cloak sweeping several ledges to the floor. He walked to the window, looking out over the moonlit courtyard where the stables sat in silent shadow. He had come to Graystone Manor to end a line of traitors, but he had instead inherited the burden of a profound, heartbreaking sacrifice. He understood the irony now. It wasn't just that he owned his enemy's castle, but that he had unwittingly become the jailer of a woman whose only crime was existing. He looked at his own reflection in the glass, the mask of cold command he had worn like armor, and saw the loose thread of his own loneliness. He and Serafina were more alike than he had ever dared to dream. Both were children of war, shaped by the neglect of fathers who didn't know how to love them. But while he had chosen the sword to gain notice, she had chosen the dirt to survive. The letter felt like a burning coal in his hand. He could no longer see Ash as a clever boy or a useful tool. She was a secret that could topple his reign or redeem his soul, and for the first time in his life, King Severin Blackthorne didn't know if he was strong enough to hold what he had taken. The twilight hung heavy over the gardens of Graystone Manor, a bruised purple sky meeting the jagged silhouette of the battlements. Severin found Ash sitting on a low stone wall near the edge of the kitchen garden, where the scent of wild lavender mingled with the metallic tang of the coming frost. The king had removed his crown, though the heavy royal purple cloak still draped over his shoulders, a reminder of the weight he carried even in the rare stillness of the evening. He stood in the shadows for a moment, watching the figure who had spent a lifetime pretending to be someone else, someone smaller. Now that the truth of the hidden letter burned in his mind, Severin could no longer see the dirt-smeared servant. He saw the way she held herself, the quiet dignity in the curve of her spine and the fierce intelligence that flickered in her amber eyes as she stared out at the dark moors. "You are a long way from the stables, Ash," Severin said, his voice cutting through the silence. The girl didn't start. She merely turned her head, the moon catching the sharp, resolute line of her jaw. "The horses are fed, and the stalls are locked, Your Majesty. Even a servant is allowed to seek the sun's last light before the world goes dark." Severin moved closer, sitting on the cold stone a respectful distance from her. The distance was a courtesy she didn't yet know she was entitled to, a silent acknowledgement of the princess beneath the rags. "I find I cannot settle tonight. This house, it feels as though it is watching me, judging a master who arrived with a sword rather than a name." Ash let out a short, soft laugh that carried no malice, only a weary sort of wisdom. "You worry too much about the stones, sire. They have seen conquerors before. They only care about who keeps the rain out and the hearths warm." "Is that all you see when you look at me?" Severin asked, his gaze fixed on her profile. "A man who merely keeps the rain out." Ash hesitated, her fingers tracing the rough, ancient texture of the wall. "I see a man who wears his power like a burden. Most kings treat their authority as a gift, but you treat it like a penance." Severin felt a sharp pang of recognition. He looked out at the dark horizon, the memories of his own youth rising like ghosts. "I was the third son of a house that valued only the first, Ash. In the grand tapestry of my father's court, I was a loose thread, easily plucked and forgotten. I was never meant for the throne. I was meant for the front lines, a warm body to fill a gap in the formation. I spent my life scraping for a scrap of notice, only to find that when the crown finally fell to me, I had no idea how to live without the mask I had built to survive the neglect." He turned to her, the vulnerability in his voice surprising even himself. "I know what it feels like to be dismissed as unworthy of attention. I know what it feels like to be overlooked by the very man who should have seen you first." Ash's amber eyes widened, a flash of raw emotion breaking through her guarded expression. The nervous resolve she usually wore like armor began to crack. "You? But you are the king. You have the world at your feet." "And yet, I have spent my life alone," Severin replied quietly. "Even now, surrounded by soldiers and advisors, I am the same invisible boy I was in my father's hall. The cloak is just a more expensive color." Ash was silent for a long moment, the tension between them shifting into something softer, something shared. "I was invisible to my father, too," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the wind. "Even before the war. I was the daughter he didn't know how to love. He looked at me and saw an inconvenience, a reminder of a legacy he couldn't protect in the way he wanted. I learned to be quiet so I could be free. I learned to disappear so I wouldn't have to see the disappointment in his eyes whenever I failed to be the son he lacked." She looked at Severin, and for the first time, she didn't look like a stable boy or even a hidden princess. She looked like a soul that had finally found its mirror in the dark. "We are both creatures of the margins, Your Majesty. We found our strength in the places where no one bothered to look. We learned to survive in the shadows of men who were too busy looking at their own reflections." Severin reached out, his hand hovering near hers on the cold stone. He didn't touch her, but the proximity felt like a promise. "Perhaps that is why I found you so quickly in that line of servants. Perhaps a ghost always recognizes another." "And what happens to ghosts when they are finally seen?" she asked, her gaze searching his. "They begin to live," Severin said, his voice firm. As the moon rose higher over Graystone Manor, the king and the girl sat in the shared solitude of the garden, two spirits forged by indifference finally finding warmth in each other's presence. Severin knew the truth of her blood, and she knew the truth of his heart. In the silence of the moors, the weight of history felt, for a moment, light enough to carry together. The iron-shod rhythm of a war party shattered the fragile silence of Graystone Manor just as the morning mist began to lift from the ravine. A single, brazen horn blast echoed off the mountain peaks, a sound like a jagged blade cutting through the cold highland air. Severin was in the courtyard, inspecting the repairs to the inner well that Ash had suggested, when the heavy gates groaned under the weight of an unwelcome arrival. He adjusted his royal purple cloak, the fabric heavy with the dampness of the dawn, and signaled for his guards to form a line. His mask of cold command snapped into place, as rigid and unyielding as the stone wall surrounding him. Beside him, he felt a small, sharp intake of breath. He didn't have to look to know it was Ash. She stood a few paces back, her hands tight around the handle of a wooden bucket, her amber eyes fixed on the portcullis with a look of ancient, paralyzing terror. The gates swung wide, and a contingent of black-armored riders thundered into the courtyard, led by a man whose presence felt like a stain on the grey morning. Lord Valerus Thorn was a man built of sharp angles and predatory ambition, his face scarred by a dozen battles he had likely started for sport. He didn't dismount, he simply looked down at Severin from the back of a massive, foam-flecked charger, a sneer curling his lip. "King Severin," Valerus called out, his voice a gravelly rasp that carried to every corner of the courtyard. "I had heard you were busy playing house in this nest of vipers. I didn't realize you had become so attached to the traitor's dust." Severin stepped forward, his hand resting casually on the hilt of his sword. The movement was a warning, silent and absolute. "Lord Valerus, I wasn't aware the border lords were permitted to move their armies without a royal summons. You are a long way from your own lands." "I go where the hunt leads me, Majesty," Valerus replied, his gaze darting toward the line of servants standing near the stables. Severin felt a cold spike of dread as the warlord's eyes lingered on Ash for a heartbeat too long before returning to the king. "And the hunt has been very fruitful indeed. It seems the late Lord Graystone was more clever than even you gave him credit for. He didn't just leave behind a castle, he left behind a key to the entire kingdom." Severin's jaw tightened. "The traitor is in exile, and his line ended with his flight. There is nothing here for you but stone and cold wind." Valerus laughed, a harsh, metallic sound. "Don't play the fool, Severin. It doesn't suit a man who took a throne by force. We both know the rumors. The traitor didn't just have secrets, he had a daughter. Princess Serafina. The true blood of the Blackthorne line. My scouts have been tracking her for weeks, and all trails lead back to these mountains. They say she was hidden away, a little bird in a cage of shadows." The warlord leaned forward over his saddle, his eyes narrowing with a dark, calculating light. "I am here to claim her. By the old laws, a marriage between my house and the Blackthorne blood would end any question of legitimacy for your reign, or mine. I demand you hand over the girl. I have no desire to burn this castle to the ground to find her, but I will if you force my hand." The silence that followed was heavy with the scent of wood smoke and impending violence. Severin felt the weight of the hidden letter in his study, the secret that now felt like a lead weight in his chest. He glanced back, seeing Ash standing frozen, her knuckles white against the wooden bucket. She looked like a stable boy to anyone else, but to Severin, she was the only light in a room full of shadows. "You are chasing ghosts, Valerus," Severin said, his voice dropping into the low, dangerous tone that had once commanded legions. "There is no princess here. There is only my staff and my soldiers. If you wish to contest my rule, do it on a battlefield like a man, rather than hounding a child who doesn't exist." Valerus's expression soured, his hand moving toward his own blade. "A bold lie, even for you. But I didn't come here on a whim. I have witnesses who say she was seen in these very gardens. I will give you until sunset to produce the girl, Severin. If she is not brought to my camp by the time the shadows touch the ravine, I will consider your refusal an act of war against the Council of Lords." With a sharp jerk of the reins, Valerus turned his horse, his riders following in a chaotic swirl of black steel and mud. As they disappeared through the gates, the courtyard felt colder than it had a moment before. Severin turned to find Ash dropping the bucket, the water splashing unheeded over her boots. Her face was deathly pale, the amber eyes wide with the raw fear that threatened to consume her. "He knows," she whispered, her voice trembling. "He's going to tear this place apart until he finds me." Severin walked to her, his cloak sweeping the damp earth. He didn't care who was watching. He reached out and gripped her shoulder, his hand steady and warm. "He knows nothing but greed, Serafina. He thinks you are a prize to be won. He doesn't realize that I didn't just seize a castle." "What are you going to do?" she asked, her gaze searching his. "I am going to do what your father couldn't," Severin said, his mask of command finally breaking to reveal a fierce, protective fire. "I am going to stop being the jailer and start being the shield. Let him bring his war. He will find that Graystone Manor has a much harder heart than he imagined." As the shadows began to stretch across the moor, the king and the princess stood together in the eye of the storm, the weight of their shared secret finally becoming the armor they would need for the battle to come. The sun began its final descent behind the jagged peaks of the highlands, casting long, bloody streaks of light across the great hall of Graystone Manor. The air inside was thick with the scent of unlit tallow and the cold, metallic tang of tension. King Severin stood at the dais, his royal purple cloak draped over the back of the ironwood throne like a fallen shadow. His hands were clasped behind him, his knuckles white, as the heavy thud of boots announced the return of Lord Valerus Thorn. Valerus marched into the hall, his black armor still smeared with the mud of the moors. He didn't come alone, a dozen of his most seasoned house guards flanked him, their hands resting on the hilts of their claymores. The king's own soldiers shifted in the shadows, spears leveled, the silence between the two factions vibrating like a drawn bowstring. "The shadows have touched the ravine, Severin," Valerus called out, his voice echoing off the vaulted ceiling. "The time for games is over. Where is the girl? Where is the princess?" Severin didn't move. His mask of cold command was a masterpiece of iron and indifference. "I gave you my answer at dawn, Valerus. You are chasing the wind. There is no princess here. There are only the survivors of a traitor's house, and they are under my protection." Valerus stepped forward, a jagged smile cutting across his scarred face. "Protection? Or possession? I've spent the last few hours speaking with your men, Severin. Some of them are more talkative than others when gold is involved. They spoke of a stable boy, one who spends his nights in the library and his evenings in the garden with the king. A boy with eyes the color of ancient amber." Severin felt the world around him go very still. He caught sight of Ash standing near the heavy stone pillar at the edge of the hall, her head bowed, the leather cap pulled low over her brow. She looked small, a mere smudge of grey against the grandeur of the room, but the way she trembled was visible even from the dais. "Bring the boy forward," Valerus commanded, gesturing to his men. "He is a servant of this house," Severin snapped, his voice a low growl. "He is not a pawn for your delusions. If he is just a servant, then you won't mind if I take a closer look," Valerus retorted. In a blur of black steel, the warlord lunged toward the pillar. Severin moved to intercept, his own sword clearing its scabbard with a hiss of silver, but Valerus was faster. He didn't draw his weapon. Instead, he reached out a gauntleted hand and seized Ash by the collar of her rough wool tunic, yanking her into the center of the hall. The girl stumbled, the wooden bucket she had been holding clattering across the floor, the sound like a gunshot in the vaulted space. "Let him go!" Severin roared, the point of his blade hovering inches from Valerus's throat. Valerus ignored the steel. He stared down at the trembling figure in his grip, his eyes alight with a predatory triumph. Such fine features for a shoveler of manure, he mused. With a brutal tug, he ripped the leather cap from Ash's head. The silence that followed was absolute. Released from the confines of the cap, a torrent of rich, mahogany hair spilled over the girl's shoulders, catching the last of the deep red sunlight. The grime on her face could not hide the delicate curve of her cheek or the unmistakable, haunting elegance of her features. She looked up, her amber eyes wide and bright with a raw, terrifying courage. "Behold!" Valerus shouted, his voice ringing with a terrible joy as he addressed the gathered court and the king's own stunned soldiers. "The stable boy of Graystone. The hidden treasure of the Highlands. Here stands Severin Blackthorne, the true heir to the throne you sit upon, Severin." The indrawn breath of 100 men filled the hall. Severin's guards lowered their spears, their faces pale with shock as they looked upon the girl they had treated as a common drudge. The secret was out, the invisible wall between them shattered into 1,000 jagged pieces. Ash, Severina, slowly straightened her back. The nervous resolve she had worn like a cloak for years finally fell away, leaving behind a cold, royal poise that seemed to radiate from her very bones. She didn't look at Valerus, she looked straight at Severin. "It's true," she said, her voice low and steady, carrying through the hall with the weight of a decree. "I am Severina. My father branded himself a traitor to save me from men like you, Valerus. He turned his own home into my prison so that the world would forget I existed." Valerus tightened his grip on her arm. "And now you will be the bridge to my glory. You will marry me, princess, and your blood will wash away the stain of this king's conquest." Severin stepped down from the dais, his purple cloak sweeping the stone floor. He didn't look like a conqueror anymore, he looked like a man who had finally found something worth dying for. He leveled his sword at Valerus's heart, his eyes burning with a fierce, protective fire that silenced the room. "Release her," Severin said, his voice a calm, lethal promise. "She is no longer a hidden secret, Valerus. She is the Duchess of this manor, and she is under the protection of the king. If you do not let her go, I will paint these walls with your blood before the moon clears the peaks." The great hall balanced on the edge of a massacre. The hidden princess stood in the center of the storm, no longer a ghost in the margins, but the sun around which the entire kingdom now turned. The heavy, weighted silence of the great hall was a physical thing, pressing against the lungs of every man present as the deep red sunlight finally bled out of the high windows. Lord Valerus Thorn still held Severina by the arm, his gauntlet a dark stain against the pale fabric of her tunic, but the air in the room had changed. It no longer smelled of a conquest, it smelled of a revolution. Severin stood at the base of the dais, his sword leveled with a hand that did not tremble, despite the absolute ruin he was about to invite upon his reign. "Severin, think of the council," Valerus hissed, his predatory eyes darting toward the king's guards, who were still reeling from the revelation. "The lords only accepted your crown because you promised to sweep away the rot of the old regime. If you stand with her, if you protect the blood of the man they all agreed to exile, you aren't just a conqueror anymore. You're a pariah. They will tear you from that throne before the week is out." Severin took a step forward, the heavy sweep of his royal purple cloak whispering against the stone. "I have spent my life doing exactly what was expected of me, Valerus. I filled the gaps in my father's lines. I wore the mask of the cold commander. I took this castle to prove I was the king the council wanted. But looking at you, I realize I would rather be a pariah than a man who uses a girl's blood to buy his safety. In a motion so swift it seemed to blur in the torchlight, Severin bridged the gap between them. He didn't strike with the blade. Instead, he stepped directly into Valerus's personal space, his shoulder slamming into the warlord's chest with the force of a battering ram. The impact broke Valerus's grip on Seraphina. As the warlord stumbled back, his boots skidding on the stone, Severin reached out and pulled the girl behind him. He stood as a wall of steel and velvet between the princess and the world that wanted to consume her. The mask of cold command didn't just break, it fell away entirely, replaced by a fierce, raw humanity that seemed to radiate from him like heat. "Let every man here witness this," Severin's voice boomed, vibrating through the ancient rafters. Seraphina Blackthorne is no longer a secret. She is not a prize to be bartered, nor is she a ghost to be hunted. She stands under my personal protection. To touch her is to strike at the king. To demand her hand is to declare war upon my house. Valerus straightened his armor, his face twisting into a mask of pure, unadulterated rage. "You are choosing a stable boy's daughter over your own crown, Severin. You are throwing away a kingdom for a girl who doesn't even know how to wear a gown." Severin didn't look back at Seraphina, but he felt her presence behind him, the quiet strength he had admired when he thought she was only ash. "I am choosing the only truth I've found in this entire valley," he replied, his voice dropping into a lethal, quiet calm. "I took this throne by force, Valerus. If the council wishes to take it back because I chose honor over politics, let them try. But they will have to walk through me to get to her." Behind the king, Seraphina reached out, her fingers grazing the heavy fabric of his cloak. It wasn't the touch of a frightened child, it was the steadying hand of a woman who had spent a lifetime in the shadows and was finally ready to step into the light. The nervous resolve that had defined her for years had transformed into a regal, quiet power. Valerus looked around the hall, seeing the king's guards slowly raising their spears once more, not toward the girl, but toward him. The tide of loyalty had shifted. The men who had served Severin out of fear now looked upon him with something approaching awe. He had given them something they hadn't had in years, a leader who believed in something more than a map. "This isn't the end, Severin," Valerus spat, signaling his men to retreat toward the doors. "You've made your choice. Now you get to live with the consequences. I will see you on the moor, and when I do, I'll take the girl and the crown from your cold, dead hands." As the black-armored riders retreated into the night, the great hall exhaled. Severin sheathed his sword, the sound a sharp, final click in the silence. He turned to Seraphina, the king and the princess finally standing face to face without a lie between them. He had traded his political safety for a single soul, and as he looked into her amber eyes, he knew it was the first truly royal thing he had ever done. The dawn broke over Graystone Manor with the cold, grey light of a storm that had finally arrived. Outside the main gates, the moor was a sea of black iron and fluttering banners as Lord Valerus Thorn's forces consolidated their position, their fires winking like malevolent eyes in the mist. Inside the great hall, the air was thick with the scent of unlit tallow and the heavy, electric hum of impending violence. Severin stood before the high windows, his royal purple cloak cast aside for a breastplate of polished steel, though he still wore the weight of his crown as a shield for the woman standing beside him. Seraphina no longer wore the rags of the stables. She was clad in a simple tunic of forest green, her mahogany hair bound back with a leather cord, her amber eyes reflecting a hard, crystalline clarity. She didn't look like a girl waiting to be rescued, she looked like a queen waiting to reclaim her name. "He won't wait for the sun to peak," Seraphina murmured, her gaze fixed on the enemy lines. "Valerus doesn't want a siege. He wants a slaughter before the other lords can arrive to witness his shame." "Then we shall give him the truth instead of a war," Severin replied, his voice a low, lethal calm. He reached into the hidden pocket of his doublet and pulled out the final pages of the late lord's secret letter, the pages he had kept close to his heart through the long, sleepless night. The gates of Graystone groaned open not to an army, but to a single, solitary figure. Severin walked out into the no-man's land between the fortress and the war party, his hands empty and his head held high. Behind him, standing at the portcullis, Seraphina watched, her presence a silent sentinel of the justice they were about to demand. Valerus rode forward, his foam-flecked charger pacing restlessly as he looked down at the king. "Have you come to beg for terms, Severin? Or have you finally realized that a crown held by a pariah is nothing more than a gilded target?" "I have come to end a lie, Valerus," Severin said, his voice carrying across the silent moor with the power of a decree. "A lie that began 20 years ago, when the previous generation allowed their hatred to blind them to the wolves in their own halls. You speak of the Blackthorne blood and the traitor's legacy, but you conveniently forgot to mention your own father's part in the rot." Valerus's sneer faltered, his hand tightening on his reins. "My father was a hero of the council. He helped purge the crown's enemies. He helped create them," Severin countered, unfurling the parchment in his hand. "These are the ledgers your father thought he had burned. They detail every secret sold to the border lords, every shipment of royal grain diverted to your own granaries, and the forged evidence that forced the late lord of this house into exile. Your family didn't purge the king's enemies, you framed a loyal protector so you could feast on his lands." A murmur rippled through Valerus's own riders. The lords who had followed the warlord began to shift in their saddles, their eyes narrowing as they looked at the documents Severin held aloft. "It's a forgery!" Valerus roared, his face twisting into a mask of desperate rage. "A king's desperate ploy to save his own skin." "The seal is unbroken, and the hand is unmistakable," Severin said, stepping closer to the warlord's horse. "But there is more. This letter proves that you, Valerus, have continued your father's work. You weren't hunting a princess to restore a bloodline, you were hunting her to silence the only witness to your family's treason. You conspired with the very wolves you claimed to fight, hoping that by marrying Seraphina, you could bury the evidence of your debts and your double-dealing forever." Severin looked past Valerus, addressing the gathered house guards and the soldiers who had been raised on stories of the traitor's villainy. "Look at the man you follow. He doesn't want a kingdom, he wants a cover for his crimes. He would see this valley burn to hide the fact that his own name is the only one that truly carries the stain of treason." Valerus drew his sword, the steel flashing in the dull morning light. "Enough. I will take what is mine by right of blood and blade." But as he spurred his horse forward, his own lieutenants moved to block his path. The weight of the truth had finally broken the spell of his command. The soldiers of the moor were men of honor, and they could see the rot in the man who led them. "The cycle of hatred ends today," Severin declared, his voice ringing with a fierce, redemptive fire. "The blood of the Blackthorns and the honor of the Townsend line will no longer be bartered for the greed of men like you. Valerus Thorn, you are stripped of your lands and your titles. You are banished from the highlands on pain of death. Go back to the shadows you crawled out of, and tell your masters that Graystone Manor is no longer a house of secrets, but a fortress of the truth." The warlord stood alone, his army now a silent wall of judgment. With a snarl of impotent fury, Valerus turned his horse and galloped away into the mist, his path marked only by the mud he kicked up in his flight. The riders he had brought with him lowered their banners, a silent surrender to a king who had finally chosen to rule with his heart instead of his mask. Severin turned and walked back toward the gates, where Seraphina stood waiting. The stable boy and the conqueror were gone, replaced by two souls who had finally found their harbor in the truth. As they stood together in the eye of the settling storm, Severin realized that in seeking to understand the past, he hadn't just saved a princess, he had finally found his own way home. The ancient chapel of Graystone Manor was no longer a cold, echoing vault of secrets, it had been transformed into a sanctuary of light and living color. Garlands of mountain heather and wild lavender draped the stone pillars, and 1,000 candles flickered against the stained glass, casting vibrant shards of sapphire and gold across the gathered lords of the highlands. The town was scandalized, of course. Whispers of a king marrying a woman who had shoveled manure in his stables flew from one end of the kingdom to the other. They called it a farce, tragedy, or a duke's madness, but as the heavy oak doors swung open, the whispers died in the throats of the most persistent gossips. Severin Blackthorne walked down the aisle not as a broken servant, but as a sovereign. She wore a gown of ivory silk that had belonged to the mother she barely remembered, altered to fit her slender, regal frame. At her throat hung the Blackthorne sun, a pendant of amber and gold that had been hidden in the manor's vaults for 20 years. Her mahogany hair was no longer hidden beneath a leather cap but flowed in soft waves over her shoulders, and her amber eyes met the gaze of the lords with a fierce, unwavering dignity that demanded respect rather than pity. Standing at the altar, Severin waited for her, his royal purple cloak cast aside for a ceremonial doublet of midnight velvet. For the first time since he had crossed the castle gates, his face was not a mask of cold command. The hard lines around his eyes had softened, and the predatory stillness of the general had been replaced by the quiet, grounded strength of a man who finally knew what he was fighting for. When she reached him, he didn't offer the clinical hand of a guardian, he took her fingers in his with a gentleness that silenced the last of the skeptics. They were married in a ceremony that united the warring factions more effectively than any treaty Severin had ever signed. The lords who had once followed the traitor or the conqueror now looked upon a united front, a king who had found his heart and a princess who had reclaimed her home. As they exchanged vows, the weight of history that had pressed down on Graystone Manor for generations seemed to lift, replaced by the promise of a peace built on the truth rather than shadows. 3 years later, on an autumn evening not unlike the one when Severin had first arrived, the king and queen of the Highlands sat in the library that had once been Serafina's only refuge. A fire crackled in the hearth, casting dancing shadows across the shelves of books that were now marked by the touch of 2 readers instead of 1. Between them, in a cradle carved from Highland oak, slept their daughter, named Elizabeth, for the mother Severin had lost to the stress of a ruined house. "She has your eyes," Severin observed softly, watching the baby's peaceful slumber. "And your stubbornness. Already, she refuses to sleep unless she is in the center of the room, being seen." Serafina laughed, a sound of pure, unadulterated joy that echoed through the halls once haunted by silence. She leaned into his embrace, her head resting against his shoulder. "I think she simply knows she is home, Severin. She doesn't have to learn how to be invisible." Severin pressed a kiss to the top of her head, his fingers trailing over the mahogany waves of her hair. "Inheriting this castle was the greatest victory of my life," he murmured. "Not because of the stones or the lands, but because I walked through that door and found the only person who could see the man behind the mask." "I love you, Severin Blackthorne," she whispered. "For seeing me when I was just a ghost in the margins." Outside the windows, the moors stretched endlessly toward the horizon, wild and beautiful and unchanging. But within the walls of Graystone Manor, the cycle of hatred had finally broken. The king had inherited his enemy's estate, and with it, a destiny that had redeemed them both. They had been overlooked and undervalued by a world that measured worth in shallow terms, but together they had written a new story, one of second chances and unexpected grace. The tale of a king and his princess would echo through the Highlands for generations to come, a whispered reminder that it is never too late to be seen, never too late to be loved, and never too late to find your way home.